running an MSP in particular, more so than the professional services side of the house, which is the billable work, is a very kind of scienced up business to run if you want to make money. And that really means focusing on metrics, focusing on indicators so that you can see problems, because that's really the only way to scale. It sounds like, as you've seen, you have to get out of that reactive brute force technique of running your business, at least in the managed services side of the house. So on the financial side, I'll give you a couple that are kind of my go-to metrics that I use, that I teach when I'm working with companies. On the financial side, I am very much about what's termed labor-loaded gross margin. You know, most people at least look at their P&L, hopefully, but a P&L, it's very difficult, in my opinion, to look at a P&L, a profit and loss statement, and kind of know whether you should be adding people, whether you're charging enough, whether your salaries are too high or too low, et cetera. So labor-loaded gross margins on the financial side are a really good metric. And basically, labor-loaded gross margin is the amount of money and the percentage of money that you make when you look at the revenue for a particular area of the business, for example, managed services, the revenue versus the direct costs and the direct compensation. So the direct costs are things like your antivirus, your Enable licensing, typically, you know, any security products you have, if you have a document management system that you use for managed services. So all of those hard costs, those direct costs, and then any direct compensation. So all of your technicians that service your managed services, potentially if you've got a manager, that cost goes in there. If it's fractional, you know, you might have a manager that services multiple areas of the company. You might have a tech that works in multiple areas of the company, so it might be fractional. So all of those costs go in there. So you basically figure out what your profit is on that area of the business, and you divide that by the amount of revenue, and that gives you your labor-loaded gross margin percentage. And for managed services, we typically target around 70% labor-loaded gross margin. So that 70% profit is what pays for the rest of your business. All your expenses, your rent, things that are not direct costs, your admin salaries, your sales salaries, all of those things. And with professional services, when we look at billable work, we typically target 60% labor-loaded gross margin. There's some variables in there about whether or not you put taxes in. Those numbers are without your government taxes. They're a little bit lower if you also include taxes in those numbers, which some people do when they do the calculation. But the nice thing about labor-loaded gross margin is when you look at it, it really shows you whether you're charging enough, not charging enough, whether you're paying too much, paying too little, whether you can add another employee, et cetera. It really gives you some good financial numbers. And then when it comes to managed services in particular, the service metrics that I look at in particular, I call it my three-legged stool. It's customer satisfaction, SLA adherence, and mean time to resolution for tickets. Mean time to resolution is just the average amount of time it takes to resolve a ticket, and that typically does not include what we'll call waiting time. So like if there's things that are out of your control that you're waiting on, you typically don't include that. If your managed services offering is business hours, then you wouldn't include overnight and so forth in that time. In other words, if a ticket's opened at, let's say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon and it's resolved at 5 o'clock, typically that mean time to resolution is 3 hours. If it's resolved the next day at 9 a.m. and your business hours are 8 to 5, then in that scenario, you'd have a 4-hour MTTR. That gives you an idea of how long it takes you to resolve tickets on average. SLA adherence is how, in the way I look at SLAs, is how quickly you can put an engineer onto a ticket and how quickly you can get that ticket working. And so that SLA adherence, once you put your targets together, now that's looking at how quickly or how much of the time you can get an engineer onto a ticket within that prescribed time frame. That's how quickly, that's how predictably you can get an engineer working on things And then the third leg of that stool is customer satisfaction, which is, to me, the most important piece of that. Without happy customers, the other things don't matter. And with happy customers, the other things are less critical. Those are the three primary metrics, big picture metrics that I look at when I look at managed services operations. There's a bunch of littler ones, stale tickets and tickets open versus closed and a bunch of other things like that. But if you want big picture, how am I doing in managed services? Those are the big three. And then for professional services or billable work, billable utilization, to me, is the number one most important metric. How much of the time your technicians are billing clients. And then obviously from that is also customer satisfaction. But typically when clients are paying by the hour, they won't pay if they're not happy. You tend to hear about that pretty quickly when they get their bill. In a nutshell, those are the big metrics that I talk about a lot and I think are really critical within your company. And when you pay attention to those things, you start to move from seat of your pants, gut feel type of management to something that's much more actionable, that all of the employees can see and sort of touch, so to speak, and understand. You can base bonuses on that so that you're not, how do I feel like my employees doing, and trying to reward them based on that, but rather hard metrics that are beneficial to the entire company and to your client base.